the title of that lecture is Subject Without Subjectivity. And I think, as each philosopher, the question I have and I try to answer is, what is philosophy? And this question is the question of the subject. What is a subject? And as you know, in the philosophy of the last 50 years or more, if you want, the whole 20th century is very critical concerning this concept of the subject of the human being as subject. And in a way, I'm fighting against this postmodern and post-structuralist or deconstructivist tradition of not of destabilizing the subject category or this notion of the subject, but to make a kind of taboo out of this category. Because I'm still insisting on the necessity of this category, and the first definition I can give of this notion of a subject is very easy. A subject is something different than an object. And what does it mean? So the question, what is a subject, is of course the question, what is the ontological structure of the human subject, of the human being? And I think the human being is irreducible, is not reducible to its object status in the established reality, socially, politically, economically, over-determined reality. I call this reality space the universe of the facts, the Tatsachenuniversum in German. And my definition of the subject is not cannot be assimilated to that texture of the facts. And maybe some of you read this lecture of Wittgenstein that I really appreciate, the lecture on ethics from 29, and there's a passage in this lecture. Wittgenstein is for a moment he says something like, "But these are facts, nothing but facts." And I really liked to read that, because I think that's how it is. The established reality as the reality as the universe of established facts, these are nothing but facts. So in a way, to make philosophy or to make art means to confront this space of established reality without accepting to be assimilated to that space or to that established texture that is the reality space or the universe of the facts. So what is a subject? The first definition I try to give is, a subject is irreducible to this texture, is irreducible to that reality space, to that, as I said, politically, economically, aesthetically, and so on, over-determined space. So me too, in that lecture, I have 5 theses. I prepared 5 theses today for this lecture to give a definition of the subject. As I understood, citizens and subjects, it's in the title of this symposium, and me as a philosopher, as I'm concerned with that, as I'm working on that concept of subjectivity and the subject, I decided to give a definition of this category. So as I said, the first thesis is a subject is something different, something totally different than only an object. That doesn't mean, of course, that there's not something what I call the object status of everybody of us as subject in the established order, in the symbolic order, if you want, with Lacan, or in the established reality, that means in the universe of the facts. So we all, nobody of us decided, for example, to be born at that time, at that place, by these parents, and so on. Okay, this makes part of what we can call the passive genesis of the subject. This makes part of the object status of the subject. But my claim is that the subject is not reducible, as I said, it's irreducible to its own object status. So that doesn't mean to deny that there is something like a passive genesis. That doesn't mean that there is to deny that there is a kind of object status of the subject, but the subject is always a little bit beyond this, beyond itself as what it is in that texture of established realities. So this is my first thesis. The second thesis is the ontological structure of a subject has to be found in its primordial or original self-transgression. Now it's easy to understand what I mean when I say primordial self-transgression. I mean the subject already, as subject, had transgressed itself towards the dimension, a dimension or the limit, if you want, of established reality or its own object status in that reality, in that established order, in the universe of the facts. And so for me, the question is not, it's not the romanticism of transgression with Bataille or not. That is not the question. It's not just to rebel against established reality. The fact is what seems to me much more important philosophically is that the subject as subject already is opened up to that dimension of what I call the dimension of incommensurability, or if you want, of subject closure. So when I decided to give this special title to that lecture today, Subject Without Subjectivity, that's what I mean. The subject without subjectivity is a subject of primordial transgression towards the dimension of subject closure. And let me precise a little bit. So in classical philosophy, if you want, in the Platonic, or of course more in the tradition of idealistic philosophy, for example, German idealism, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, you can find this notion of the subject, and you find another notion, this notion in Kant, for example, and later in Edmund Husserl, the other notion of subjectivity, of transcendental subjectivity. What does it mean? I think it's very easy, like always in philosophy, it's very easy. The transcendental subjectivity is nothing else but another name or title for the being, the universal being of each singular subject. So every one of us is a subject in its own singularity. Every one of us is different from each other, but in the classical horizon, or in the horizon of classical philosophy, or subject philosophy, if you want, the subject, the empirical or ontic subject, the singular subject, is a subject because it's participating on to that how you say, participating on this universal structure of transcendental subjectivity or universal subjectivity. And my claim is that this makes part, this notion of a subject that is a subject that is ontologically participating on that universal structure of a given subjectivity. That is the old concept of the idealistic, if you want, that makes part of the idealistic tradition of philosophy, this notion of subject, a subject with subjectivity, a subject that is a subject per definition, because it's connected to universal given structure, to universal substance, to universal essence, or a universal nature, that is the transcendental subjectivity. Against this tradition, I try to develop another concept, a different concept of the subject, the human subject as a subject without subjectivity. That means this subject is much more in what we can call, with Maurice Blanchot, if you want, in its essential solitude. So it's a subject that without being guaranteed in a universal structure of a transcendental subjectivity. And and this is what I precisely mean when I say the ontological structure of a subject has to be found in its primordial self-transgression. That means this self-transgression is not a transgression towards a new or a given space, or a second world, if you want, a world of ideas in the Platonic sense, but it's this self-transgression just means that the subject as subject is in contact with that absolute limit, with the absolute limit. This is the limit of the one world. There's only one world. There's no utopian, like in utopian concept, a second world, but this one world, if you want, in this thinking of immanence. It's not a thinking of transcendence, it's a thinking of immanence with Deleuze or not. But what seems important for me is that this one world is, as the one world, limited. It has its own incommensurability or inconsistency, and that's what. And the subject without subjectivity is a subject open up to that dimension of incommensurability. Of course, we find in the tradition, if you want, after Nietzsche, with Nietzsche and after Nietzsche, we can find in the tradition of the philosophy of the 20th century different names. This subject without subjectivity appears in that tradition under different names. I give some examples. In Nietzsche, for example, to start with Nietzsche, in Nietzsche you can find this subject as the subject of becoming, or and later Deleuze and Guattari, as you know, took this term, and they added not only the subject of becoming, but the subject of chaos, for example. Some of you read, I'm sure, What is Philosophy, this important book of Deleuze and Guattari. And before, after Nietzsche, at the beginning of the 20th century, you can, this subject without subjectivity appears as the subject of the uncanny in Being and Time, Heidegger in 27. The subject of the uncanny. Or later, in Maurice Blanchot, the subject of the exterior, en français, le dehors, the exterior or the outsider, how you want to translate. I think this, you can give other examples in Wittgenstein. As I said, it's the subject of what he calls in this lecture on ethics, the wonder, or what he calls the sphere of ethics in the Tractatus, or the sphere of aesthetics, or in the Tractatus also of the unaussprechlichen, unspeakable, I think. Yeah, that's an English translation. And for me, or in Badiou, you can say it's the subject of truth or universality. So what do I want to say? That's only the, if you want, the historical part of my intervention, to say that this subject without subjectivity is not something that I want to invent. I just want to show that it already exists. It exists in the whole philosophical tradition, and not only for the last 100 years. And for me, it's very important to try to define the ontological structure of this subject, and under this different title, subject of the becoming, subject of the uncanny, subject of the exterior, and so on. The structure always that you can find there is the subject is open to a dimension of non-subjectivity. So you can, it would be easy to say the dimension of non-subjectivity, okay, that's the world. The subject is in the world, and here again we have the problem like Descartes, how can we bring these two orders together, the order of the world and the order of the outside, if you want, and the res extensa, or extensae, and the res cogitans, the cogito, for example. But I think the problem is much deeper here, is that it's not the world like the established world, the established reality. The subject is not in the world like water in the water, like, for example, Bataille said about the animals. They are in the world like water and water. The subject is in its world like in something that, like in an element that is totally strange, that is totally uncanny for that subject. Or you can say the subject itself is an uncanny entity in that established reality. So the subject marks is another name or title for the limit of the established reality. And that's what I call the primordial self-transgression of the subject. The subject already, as subject, is a subject that is that has transgressed itself towards the dimension of this uncanny, of this dimension of the uncanny, of this dimension of becoming, of this dimension of universality, or with Heidegger too, you can say, of course, of this dimension of infinitude that is finally the dimension of death in Being and Time. Finitude is not eternity, of course. I make the difference, like other philosophers, between finitude and eternity. Okay, the third thesis I want to give is to propose is art and philosophy are two modes or two modalities of affirmation of this self-transgression. So art and philosophy are movements that have to do with affirmation, with a kind of saying yes. Yes to what? Of course not to established reality, but to the incommensurability state of established reality. So to the uncanniness of what we seem to know of reality. And to say yes to something, of course, doesn't mean to agree. To say yes just means to be open to that dimension, not to enclose myself in a kind of narcissistic, depressive narcissistic gesture, to enclose myself in the imaginary, in the image that I have for myself in the established reality. That means in my victim state or in my object status, as I said. So for me it's very important, without making psychoanalysis or psychology out of philosophy. It's, for me, these are philosophical notions when I speak about narcissism, for example. And my proposal is to make the difference, a very strict difference between the subject of narcissism and the subject of philosophy. So to make philosophy means, in a way, to transgress my own primary, with Freud or not, narcissism. To go beyond this self-enclosure in my imaginary, in my phantasms. Finally, why? With the goal, of course, to get in contact, to get in touch with this dimension of the untouchable, that is the dimension of the incommensurability, or the dimension of the nameless, or the dimension of the unspeakable. And I think, and that's the fourth thesis I want to present today, is art and philosophy only exist as contact with this dimension of incommensurability. And the Lacanian term, of course, of this dimension is the real. And Lacan, as you know, made the difference between reality and the real. And the real is the concept that speaks about the limit of established reality, a limit that is never there in a kind of positive entity. And so art and philosophy has to deal not only within reality, it has first to confront reality as it is in its status as facts, and then in a second step, at the same time, in a way, I think art and philosophy has to go beyond this universe, this dimension of the facts, or this universe of the facts, and has finally to get in contact, to risk the contact with that dimension of incommensurability, or this dimension of the real. And of course, it's totally obvious, to get in contact with that dimension of incommensurability, it demands a kind of courage of this subject. And I think every one of us who is an artist, who is a philosopher, who is a writer, so who gets in contact with something new, that means with something incommensurable, with something that he or she cannot really understand, what is something she or he don't really know at the very beginning how to deal with. You don't have to be an artist or a philosopher to make these kind of experiences. And these crisis experiences, like a life crisis, these crisis experiences, these are experiences that demand from the subject to decide, to make a decision. And of course, a decision is not the same like a choice. And the definition of a choice would be water or wine. Okay, so the choice is always something you can choose, you can or decide if you want for a choice, or accept a choice in the choice system that is another name for the established reality. The established reality is this kind of choice system. You can be for this and or for this and against the other thing or whatever. And I think it's never about choosing in art and literature, and it's never there's something more important in a crisis situation. It's not about to choose, because I think it's not a crisis. If someone asks me wine or water, I will survive whatever I choose, even if I'm very fast in my choice, and But I think a decision is something totally else. To decide means to decide for incommensurability as such. That means to decide to go beyond, to transgress, and in a kind of hyperbolic, always too fast movement, to get in contact with that dimension of incommensurability. That means to decide for something that is beyond this system of options or alternatives that is the established reality. So often I heard as a philosopher, so often I'm confronted with that kind of remarks. Yeah, but why do we make philosophy? Philosophy that's nothing than fleeing reality. Yes, I think in fact it is, but in a different way than these people think. Because it's not fleeing reality without confronting reality, but it's just not accepting reality like it is, like it is, like I can handle it, like I understand it. There is something else, but something else not in a way given like reality, not in the way of facts, like facts are given, but there is something else, something nameless, something without a face, something that is not in a second world, something that I have to fight for in this one world by confronting this own reality that exists, this own world. So this is a double challenge of philosophy and of art, as I think, is to survive reality as it is, and by taking the risk to open myself to its incommensurability status. That means to all of this what makes my life unlivable. And that's the concept currently I'm working on. I'm finishing a book on Marguerite Duras, and this something what I really like in her is that she is totally aware of this. She's totally aware that to live means to be in contact with all what is unlivable in life. And Thomas said before, he said about first the artist has to pay concerning his project, but of course not only this project, Swiss democracy, but I think that's in general. It is not only it's for every art project, and it's for every one who writes a book, and you always have to pay. That means you have to pay. Means always to pay more. I think you don't pay if you don't pay more. That then it costs, you know. And it's the same with love. Everybody knows it. It's never enough to love. You always have to love more. If you don't love more, you don't love, because then you are in the position of the child that wants the love of the mother in that kind of narcissistic gesture. The young children, they are so sure about being the position of the being the love object of the mother, of the father, of the family, or whatever in this family system. And as we know, there's nothing less innocent as children. They know how to play with that, and how to use this narcissism, and how to make a kind of power strategy out of this narcissism. Some of you read Sartre's Les Mots, and I think that's a brilliant book concerning this theme. And I think, of course, in a way, art and philosophy means to be a subject and not to be a child, to go beyond this childish narcissism, to go beyond this dictatorship of depression, to transgress my own object status, and to transgress my own status as a victim of what? Of the circumstances. And what I'm attacking in a way is, in the philosophy in the last 50 years, there you can find a kind of triumph of the object status of the subject. So in a way it's to deny the subject status of the subject, or the possibility to be a subject for the human subject. So everyone with Foucault, after Foucault, for example, and I think it's not the best Foucault when you these kind of interpretations of Foucault, everyone tries to point out, okay, first we have also in art, of course, first look at this, respect the circumstances, respect your situation, see you are the object of a historical anonymous structure that you don't, in structuralism and after, structure that you don't control yourself. So please give up this idea to be a subject. That's a phantasm, and that makes part of the idealistic tradition of philosophy, and of course you're not a subject, you are controlled by structures that you don't control, and you are first and nothing than this, an object of circumstances. And I think that's very weak. That's a very weak and very childish and very narcissistic and a very powerful and very depressive concept of philosophy, and art, and I don't agree with that. And that's why I try today to give my own definition of philosophy. What is philosophy? Philosophy, of course, doesn't mean to read books, to be intellectual, to read books, to know a lot of things about the history of philosophy, or sometimes to write a book your own. Of course, sometimes you can't avoid it. You do it, you write a book, why not? But I think philosophy, first of all, is really to confront the incommensurability or the unlivable of your life. So, philosophy is not an academic procedure. Philosophy just means to be alive. Just to start to be alive, to transgress this kind of childish narcissism, self-victimization, this, as I said, not at all innocent position of the narcissistic subject or quasi-subject that always is in that always is refusing its own possibility of being a subject of its own. And I think philosophy means just to be a subject, to take the risk, in a way, I'm sorry, to be adult. To stop here and say, okay, and we transgressed, if you want, the phantasms of classical concept of subject as a subject that is connected to a concept like autonomy or self-transparency and so on. Anyway, it was never about self-transparency, even not in Hegel. But I think the problem is just not to stop here, to go a step further and to say, okay, there is something like an object status. I'm maybe, if you want to call it like this, and for some people less privileged than me and most of us, I suppose, there are real victims in situation. They live situations or they live lives in parts of the world or even here, much less privileged than we. And of course, they have, in a way, the right, or they are right. They don't have the right, but they are right to claim that they are in that kind of victim position. But I think even for them, there is something. There remains in a kind a minimum of freedom, to confront their own victim status, and then to confront my own victim status means already to take in the first step to take responsibility for my becoming in the established reality, for my passivity, for my object status. And that's and of course when I say art and philosophy are movements, always too fast, always blind, always self-exaggeration, movements of in this kind of movements in that kind of precipitancy, by touching the dimension of the untouchable. Then it's I can translate this structure or this definition of art and philosophy. I can put it in a definition of what it means to live, just to live. And I think to live doesn't mean to be a philosopher or to make art, but to live means to take the risk, to have the courage, to get in contact, to be in contact with this dimension of the exterior, that is the dimension that is the truth of reality, of my reality. It's the truth of that situation, but it's not the situation itself. But it's something that is the truth of the situation, that is this what exceeds this situation, what exceeds established reality. And to get in contact with the unlivable of my own life. That would be my philosophical definition of life, and if you want, and of a kind of authentic life. I like and I love this concept of authenticity. I know that it's a kind of forbidden word, I know, like freedom, and I think that's something that a philosopher cannot accept. when I make a lecture and I speak about freedom and this kind of hyperbolic responsibility, to take the responsibility for what I'm not responsible, in fact, because that responsibility starts with that, to take the responsibility without being guilty, in a way, and to take the responsibility for what is much more, what is beyond my own capacities and my own possibilities, to take the responsibility for that. And when I make a lecture and I'm speaking about freedom and insisting on the necessity of these concepts, sometimes I got this reaction, but you don't know the Bush administration, they speak about freedom and responsibility. Okay, but I think I can't avoid it, and that's like it is, but I think we cannot accept a kind of monopole, yeah, of these these crucial concepts that makes part of the Occidental history of philosophy for more than 2,500 years. We cannot give the monopole for these concepts, for this crucial concept, to the Bush administration. I think it's a good reason, because they use it to use it in a better and a more clear way and in a more substantial way, and I think that makes part of the philosophical work. The fifth thesis I want to present is the affirmation of this concept of the unlivable, of the incommensurability, of freedom, of course, of absolute freedom, yeah? Or with the real, of this touching of the untouchable, is the very condition of what I would call ontological happiness. And I like this concept of happiness because I think there's no alternative to happiness for everybody of us. The alternative would be depression, cynicism, nihilism, and infantilism, and there's no narcissism that is not an infantilism. And I think please, more dignity for all of us, everybody. Please, more dignity, and I can't accept for my own life to stay in that position, and sometimes I have the feeling, okay, to be in a bad situation, but I think just confront the situation and take the responsibility for that, even if you don't agree with your situation at that moment. And I think philosophy is nothing but this, nothing but taking the responsibility for incommensurability as such, and to affirm myself, to say yes to myself as a subject of its own impotence. Impotence, is that the word in English? Yeah. Okay, because of course I don't control everything, and that's why I say this a decision is always too fast, because when you have to decide, you're in a space without, it's a kind of twilight zone, you don't see everything, but you have to decide. You don't control the situation, but you have to decide. You decide always in urgency. You have to decide now, today. Tomorrow is too late, and you feel that pressure. Everyone knows that. And I give, for example, an example for the decision that I like, because I believe in love, and I will think, as Thomas pointed out, we made this. We decided for this 10 concepts for our map of friendship, and philosophy, and of art, friendship of art and philosophy, and one of these concepts is love. And what I said before, love always means to love more, to love more. Not only to love what I can love, or to like what I like, if you want, or to pay for what I can pay, because I have enough money with me. You don't pay if you just pay like this, for this what you can pay. But you don't love if you love someone that you control in the way. So someone who you understand. You always have to have loving someone, for example, means to be in contact with the incommensurability of the other. That means with the otherness of the other. And because I don't understand, because I don't completely, of course, because you always understand more than you think. But of course you don't understand. Sometimes you don't understand. Everyone knows it, and it's not only a question of sexual difference, but this too, I think. And you don't understand, and you are confronted with reactions, or with a desire that you don't understand, and that's the moment, that's the crisis moment. You have to continue loving, or you have to say yes, I don't understand, but I say yes. That's love, and I think that's philosophy. Just to say yes to something that I don't understand, without of course, as I said, without accepting in a way, it's not a question to like it, but just to say yes. And that's a very condition. This hyperbolic yes, this blind yes is a very condition of what I would call as authentic life. And that's what I call happiness. And let me come back for a moment to Marguerite Duras, that I admire so much for this, because she's so strong in confronting the unlivable part, if you want, of love, of life. I think in all her books you can find, and it's not. Sometimes you can read this in books on Marguerite Duras, that they say, okay, Marguerite Duras, it's so it's pathetic, and there's so much tragedy in this love encounters. And I think with Maurice Blanchot, Marguerite Duras, it's much more complicated, of course, because with Maurice Blanchot, Marguerite Duras knows that the question is that each real encounter is an encounter between two ghosts, if you want, and each love is a love. Don't have two totally self-transparency subjects loving each other by knowing each other. If that would be the case, you wouldn't need love. Love just means the opposite in a way. Love means not to understand. The other is a kind of ghost for me, remains like a kind of ghost for me. But I say yes to that ghost, while knowing that for this other the situation is not totally different. So in each encounter you can find this kind of failure of encounter. But this failure is the very condition of a real encounter, of the encounter of the real, or the confrontation of the real. And I give you another example. I don't remember very well, in this Godard film, where is it, Le Mépris, I think, and this is it Jean Seberg lying in the bed with Jean-Paul Belmondo, and she asks him, "Why do you love me?" Something like this. You remember better than me, I think. But what I remember, and even if I'm not right, it's important, for me it's important than this kind of misunderstanding, because I think she asks him, "Why do you love me?" And he, of course, he says, "I love you because your beautiful hairs, your humor, your eyes, or whatever." And of course it's totally obvious she's totally unsatisfied. And he, a little bit stupid, of course, he can continue for 1 million years, and there are a lot of arguments why you love, but if you love, you don't have arguments. And to love means loving without alibi, without arguments, always being in that kind of blindness. Some parents they say to their children when they have their first love, take care, and love makes you blind, and so on. Yes, of course, but that's the wonder of love. Then finally to say, yes, I'm blind, but I agree, and I say yes to that blindness, and this yes to that blindness, yes to that incommensurability, I would call that brings you. I think that's not the way to happiness. Of course, there's no way to happiness. But if there's any chance, any possibility to be happy, then I really believe in this. The happiness is not on the side of the people, of these narcissistic subjects that don't have the courage to make a decision, that don't have the courage to pay for this decision, that don't have the courage to affirm this kind of over hasty movement towards the otherness of the other, or the dimension of the real, or the dimension of incommensurability. So the happiness is always on the side of the subject of decision, not of choice. And so it's always on the side of the subject of love, and I believe in that it's always on the side of the subject of art and philosophy. And that's why I'm a philosopher. Thank you.